Greetings YouTube, Remarkable Republican here once again to bring you the truth with a truth-flavored bias. Today we're taking a look at the top 10 movies of the 2000s. This was a really strong movie decade, however there were some problems. One is that, as I'll show you, while there are some great movies, none of them are really in contention for being the best of all time. That's one problem, but a much bigger problem is format. The 2000s were a time of transition, and the transition was a very negative one when it comes to the quality and comparability of movies. Let me explain. The 2000s is when DVDs really came out and became common, and when TVs changed from CRT to flat screen. It was also the time when many movies began to appear in files that you could put on your computer or play on a DVD or Blu-ray disc. Now, the thing you might know about film, just from the name of it, is that traditionally the way a movie works, you put film in a camera, physical chemical film, then the images are burned onto the film, you take the film, put it in a tape, and the tape is the movie. That is how film is supposed to work, and that is the proper resolution of film. When people talk all this numerical crap like 1080p or 4K, they are talking nonsense. The resolution of film is film. Also, there is a proper resolution for film. That proper resolution is 4 by 3. In the 2000s, up until about the middle of the decade, you could easily get TVs which were 4 by 3 and displayed everything the correct way without wasting screen space. Now, to get the correct 4 by 3, you have to manually set it, and a lot of newer things aren't designed to look the way they're supposed to look in 4 by 3. And it's really fucked up, and the 2000s in that sense was a terrible time of transformation. 9/11 was not the biggest tragedy of the decade. It was the move away from traditional video technology, which was vastly superior in every way. This also means it's very hard to compare movies visually in terms of effects. A movie will simply look much different when it is running on a 4 by 3 CRT with a VCR than it will on a Blu-ray or some digital bullshit. So that's to be kept in mind. And also, I just wanted to remind everybody that remember when all of us used to use PS2s for DVD players and we still had our CRTs? That was also like the second half of the decade. A lot of people tried to be cool and not use VCRs anymore. But really, it was a real tragedy when the VCR went out. I think that there's actually a market in place to recreate a market share for VCRs just for high-end customers who want to have the authentic movie experience, and then produce limited quantities of modern releases but in 4 by 3 resolution on film. So if anybody out there would want to go in with into a business arrangement with me on that, I'm thinking about that very seriously. I've been trying to make a business plan on that. Please let me know. Another issue that you see in the 2000s is that the decade was very much shaped by 9/11. So 9/11 comes up in a lot of things, so we'll have to deal with that issue as well. Anyway, let's get on to the honorable mentions. Let's look at our honorable mentions. One thing I note about this decade is that it had a wide variety of genres, so that is something to be praised for sure. The 2000s didn't necessarily master any one genre, but it did everything pretty well. If they mastered any genre, it'd probably have to be comedy. But anyway, let's get into the movies themselves. 1408 was a great Stephen King novel, and it made a good movie as well. Shoot 'em Up was a great action movie, very original, kind of like Kill Bill but with guns, so basically better. The Dark Knight was a strong part of the Batman trilogy, and it may have been the most memed movie of the decade, easily. I would say it is, actually. The Dark Knight is not quite as objectively good as one other movie in that franchise, but it is pretty solid. The Patriot, this was probably Mel Gibson's best movie post-2000. It's also a very historically accurate picture of the American Revolution, promotes love of country, it's got some good action, some good grit. Master of Disguise, this is probably the last great Dana Carvey movie. Die Another Day, this was the last Pierce Brosnan James Bond movie. It was really good. Quantum of Solace, this was the second Craig Bond movie, also very excellent. This one definitely has a very dark tone to it, which a lot of James Bond fans were thrown off by, but personally, while I prefer a little bit more of the goofy tone, I liked the darker, more kick-ass and take names version of James Bond. The original Taken movie came out in about 2009. That was pretty damn good. There were also a number of X-Men movies, X-Men, X-Men The Last Stand, X-Men Origins Wolverine. Those were all really good as well. Spider-Man 1 through 3, these are really good movies, and had we had a better Spider-Man actor, one of these probably could have made the top 10. The writing for these was excellent, but unfortunately Tobey Maguire just isn't believable as a superhero. He's a little bit too much of a bitch. Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, these were both really good movies, but they didn't quite crack the top 10. If one of them had, it would have been Attack of the Clones, but they are certainly very good, and I think that over time people are starting to appreciate how good the prequels actually were, but it is taking time. There is a movie called Druids. Most of you probably never heard of it. This came out in France, of all places, but it's a very historically accurate action movie about the time of Julius Caesar, and I recommend that anyone watch it if they're interested in that period of history. There was the Pirates of the Caribbean series. Most of them came out in the 2000s. The Curse of the Black Pearl, Dead Man's Chest, At World's End. Both of those were really, all three of those were really good, but none of them was quite top 10 material. If any of them were to hold up over time, it'd definitely be Curse of the Black Pearl, though, the original. Also, The Fellowship of the Ring and Return of the King. The three Lord of the Ring movies came out back to back to back, 2001 to 3. They were quite extraordinary at the time, and I think that if you ask somebody when they first came out or at the end of the 2000s, most likely that person would have said, well, obviously the top 10 will have all three Lord of the Rings films. But over time, I think that they haven't aged all that well, and also part of the problem is what I was talking about earlier with 4x3 and the transition away from CRT. These movies were meant to look the way that they're supposed to look on a CRT, so that doesn't transition well to flat screens. And especially that last scene in Return of the King looks like absolute dog shit unless you're watching on a VCR with the CRT. Maybe you could get away with the PS2 DVD and then CRT, but if you really want to see Return of the King and have it look the way it's supposed to look and remind you of why that was such a good movie, you've got to watch it on a VCR. There are also the Transformers movies, Transformers and then Revenge of the Fallen. Both of those are really good. The original was a little bit better. There were quite a few good comedies. Bruno was really funny. It was this guy who pretended to be German, and he pretended to be a really aggressive gay German dude, and he went around messing with people. It was pretty funny. Borat, this was also pretty funny. Had some great moments in it. As a whole, it didn't quite come together, but a lot of the individual skits were pretty amazing. Pearl Harbor was an excellent war movie. Now, it's a little bit sort of held back by mostly being sort of a romance movie about Ben Affleck's character, but the war parts in this are really good, and had it focused more on that, it would have probably cracked the top 10. Catwoman, this was Halle Berry in her prime in a cat suit, so obviously it was cool, but it could have been a little better, I guess. Not quite as good as Batman, but very respectable nonetheless, especially when the 2000s was a little bit short on good superhero movies, unlike this past decade. House of Wax. This was a great horror film that's often overlooked. It was genuinely scary, and it also starred some unusual people. Paris Hilton was in this, of all people, and surprisingly, she was really good. Jurassic Park 3. This is an overlooked and underrated part of the Jurassic Park franchise. It introduced a dinosaur they made up with a crocodile head, so it was pretty cool looking, and it really gave the T-Rex a run for his money. So that was a good one. The Chronicles of Riddick. This was back when Vin Diesel was really the shit, and you can see why if you watch Chronicles of Riddick. The Wicker Man, underrated film. Excellent performance. This is basically about what happens if you go to visit some cult. It was the way, basically what was happening is that Nicolas Cage played a character who was effectively killed at the altar of Scientology. That's what the movie is actually about. Not a lot of people know that. And so it has an important message. And while there are parts of it that are weird, it's because he's trying to hint to the audience that it's actually about Scientology. So it creates a little bit of a disconnect. It's a little odd. Night at the Museum, that was a pretty imaginative movie. Possibly the best one Ben Stiller's ever been in. Superman Returns, very good superhero movie. Could have been a little better, but pretty damn solid. Halloween, the Rob Zombie version, this was a really good reimagining of Halloween. The first Saw movie was really good. Alien vs. Predator was badass, even though it could have used a little more plot. The Dukes of Hazzard, Johnny Knoxville, Owen Wilson, Jessica Simpson, really likable cast. Can't really go wrong there. Walking Tall, this was The Rock doing a remake of a Joe Don Baker movie. And unlike the original movie, which totally sucked, this one was great. And it's sort of the blueprint of how you do a remake properly. In the next decade, we see that a whole lot of old 80s movies are remade and made a lot better. So Red Dawn and a few others. But we'll get there when we get there. I haven't made that movie yet. Snakes on a Plane. Samuel L. Jackson's most iconic film. Get these motherfucking snakes off this motherfucking plane. Great movie. I'm not usually a big fan of blaxploitation movies, but that one was really good. Timeline, this is based on a Michael Crichton novel. It is pretty solid. He's also the same guy who wrote Thin Red Line, so he can be relied upon to write good stuff. Van Helsing, this was a movie I went to, and a girl gave me a hand job, so I had to put this on the list. It's actually not that great of a movie, but who gives a shit. The Scorpion King, this was The Rock at his best. This was one of the sequels to the Mummy series, so this was really solid. The first Hangover movie, very good. Probably the best in the trilogy, but in a decade that had so many great comedies, it wasn't quite able to crack the top 10. Napoleon Dynamite. This was a good movie. Personally, I'm not a fan of it, but I do recognize the quality of it. And also, it's important because it shows what life is like outside of New York and LA. Napoleon Dynamite is set in like Indiana or somewhere, and so it shows a much different version of America. G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra. This is back when 80s nostalgia was really in gear. And I imagine in 2010 or 2011, if you'd asked me to make a top 10 movies of the last decade, I would have said G.I. Joe, Rise of Cobra is easily probably like 6 or 7. But over time, it's become clear that it wasn't quite as good as everyone thought. And a lot of that was just that 80s nostalgia that was kicking in late 2000s, early 2010s. Avatar, this is one that people probably would have named as the best movie of the decade right as that decade was ending, but that was a recency issue because it had just come out and the effects were mind-blowing. But Avatar is actually pretty leftist. It is explicitly basically an Obama propaganda film. That being said, it was still revolutionary in a lot of ways, and it really helped set the stage for more advanced movies later on. Alex Jones made an excellent documentary called The Obama Deception. This is one which at the time didn't get good reviews, but now that we've lived through the Obama presidency, I think it's safe to say that he was right, and you deserve an honorable mention if you can correctly predict something. Paul Blart Mall Cop, the original, great movie, probably the best thing that Kevin James has ever done, so really worth looking out for if you're looking for a light comedy. The first Iron Man movie, really good. And then the second Resident Evil movie, Resident Evil Extinction, was quite solid. So now let's get into the actual top 10 of the 2000s. One of the strongest decades, even if it doesn't have any one show-stopping movie which is contending for best of all time. Number 10, Resident Evil. This was a really great video game in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s. And My fear was when this movie came out that it would just be a cheap cash grab like the Mario movie had been in the 90s. But what I found instead is that this was a really good video game movie. And it was so good they made like 5 sequels to it, so it launched a franchise. This is a blend of horror and action which would set a standard for about 15 or so years when it comes to how to do horror and also how to do video game movies. This standard was ended by the movie Get Out, and that's one of the reasons why I personally can't stand the movie Get Out. But we're not going to go there until we get to the next video. Perfect job here of balancing fidelity to the source content, the video games, but also internal storytelling. This movie exists on its own, and you don't need to play the video games to understand it. So it's a perfect balance, and it really did something that many people thought was impossible. So Resident Evil, quite a good movie. Number 9, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers. The Two Towers is the best of the trilogy because it is the most realistic according to medieval realism. It has excellent effects, the visuals are great, the acting is very solid, and it's also balanced. We have people doing heroic stuff, people working hard, we have people trying to do evil. Everybody's doing what they're doing, and they're all doing it competently and without a lot of complaining. This is better than the other two films in the series for a number of reasons. First up, the Battle of Helm's Deep still looks impressive even today, and at the time it was mind-blowing. Wormtongue and Saruman are great new villains, and it is very rare that you see villains who come close to being as good as they were. Of course, Gandalf and all of the heroes are also excellent, but I think the villains really stand out here because this is kind of the low point in the trilogy where the bad guys have the upper hand and the heroes are beginning to suffer. So it does a lot of things really well. As for Fellowship and Return of the King, both of them are good, but Fellowship just isn't as good of a conversion of the book as Two Towers and Return of the King are. Two Towers takes all of the important details and puts them into the movie. Fellowship cuts a lot of stuff out, including several characters altogether. So Fellowship in that sense was not a very faithful adaptation. As for Return of the King, like I said earlier, the only way you can really watch it and truly get an idea of what it's supposed to look like is if you have a VCR and a CRT. Otherwise, it might give you eye cancer. For whatever reason, The Two Towers doesn't have that problem, at least not to the same extent. However, if you really want to get the full effect of this trilogy, I highly suggest that you get a VCR and an old CRT, because then you will really experience what it was like. If you're watching it on a modern format, then it will still be a good story, but you're not really going to be able to appreciate what it was supposed to be like. Number 8, You Don't Mess with the Zohan. This is easily Adam Sandler's best movie of the decade, and I think that he really set a precedent that is being followed a lot now. So there aren't all that many great action stars anymore because of SJWs. So what happens a lot of times is that as a comedian is on the verge of being too old to do action, he'll wait till he's maybe like 40, 45 and then get ripped to shit and then do like 2 or 3 action movies because there's no one else who could do it better because, let's face it, where are the real men at? I mean, we have Liam Neeson, who's probably 70 years old, still doing action movies. There's a reason for that. So Adam Sandler kind of got this trend started of comedians doing this. And he did this with You Don't Mess with the Zohan, and it works really, really well. It's basically a classic comedy formula of a ridiculous Adam Sandler character, but set for a 9/11 world where this guy is worried about world security, so he's taken time off from his real interest, which is hairdressing, in order to defend his country. In this case, it's Israel. It's a strong action comedy in a decade where most movies were very much genre-bound. Most movies would either be an action or a comedy, but this movie is both. And I think that because it was something that wasn't being done at the time, it was revolutionary, and it really broke a lot of new grounds in terms of mixing genres. In many ways, You Don't Mess with the Zohan is more or less an update and improvement of the 1988 movie Tracks, where you have a guy whose real ambition is to make cookies. and he has to quit his job as a special forces guy, and then to make money to keep his cookie thing going, he has to kick a bunch of ass and take out a bunch of criminals. I don't know if you Don't Mess with Zohan is the best Adam Sandler film, but it's got to be up there. It's either this or Billy Madison. It's a hard call. My gut says this movie, but again, that's a 50-50 ball, total coin toss. The seventh best film of the decade was Doom. Now, this is something that really depended on Resident Evil to get where it was going, since Resident Evil sort of broke the mold and proved that video game movies could be both good and successful. And Doom was very much both of those things. This was the second successful video game adaptation, but after Resident Evil, not counting its sequels, none others have been done. And this is also where that phenomenon will really peak. This is easily the best ever video game movie. Now, Doom really tapped into 90s nostalgia. Anyone who lived in the early 90s remembers trying to play Doom, especially if you were a kid and you didn't have easy access to it. The story here also does what Resident Evil does by being faithful to the material, but also having its own thing going on. And clearly the people who wrote this were familiar with the work of Graham Hancock, the brilliant archaeologist who proved that there was a former civilization on Mars. He looks at all the photos and shows how that's the case. So this is basically inspired by real Martian history, so it's pretty cool. The Rock in this movie is the leader of a group of Marines. I won't spoil how things go, but basically they arrive not expecting any shit, and well, it's Doom, so shit is what they find. I would say that this is basically the storytelling experience that Doom 3 tried to be, but couldn't. Doom 3, by the way, is a video game which really sucked ass that came out about the same time as the movie. And I have to say, I won't spoil it, but the last scene of this movie is fucking epic. So if you haven't seen Doom, I highly recommend checking it out. This scene is epic on a scale that is easily more epic than any of the battles in Lord of the Rings. And you know how I feel about Helm's Deep, so that tells you everything you need to know. I suggest you watch this movie, at least that last scene. Number 5, Freddy Got Fingered. This was really the last great pre-9/11 movie. It was a brilliant comedy and the best comedy of the decade. Perhaps it was a little harder to laugh after the towers fell, but before the towers fell, the world was a lot more lighthearted, and Freddy Got Fingered captures that moment in time when America was still innocent. It's a brilliant comedy. It's almost a throwback to the 90s, but it's one which also closes that chapter of comedy, but does so in a way that is a magnificent send-off. There are so many great moments in this movie, it's hard to really even explain what it's about because it is so off the beaten path. But suffice to say, Daddy, would you like some sausage? Daddy, would you like some sausage? Daddy, would you like some sausage? Number 4, National Treasure. This film itself is a national treasure. It's a great film which promotes a love of country and an interest in American history. It's one of Nicolas Cage's greatest performances. He doesn't do anything weird, but it still works. It's everything that Indiana Jones should have been. Now, I kind of like Indiana Jones, but let's face it, there's not really a good message there, and a lot of times the plot doesn't make as much sense as it should. That especially applies to that last Indiana Jones movie where, yeah, it could have been a hell of a lot better. National Treasure, though, is the Indiana Jones of the 2000s and beyond. And I'm excited to report that I have heard they're making another National Treasure movie soon. So I'm really looking forward to that, and I'm sure that it will kick some real ass once again. And also spark people's interest in the Founding Fathers, the Constitution, and everything that makes this country the greatest on earth. In the 2000s, Japanese manga was super popular, and this is something that was basically a visual novel. It had a bunch of pictures that would tell the story, and a lot of people would buy them who couldn't actually read Japanese, but they were pretentious and pretended they could. But the art style would really tell the story, and it was something that had been selling a lot of paper. So Frank Miller came along and he decided to make manga style movies but with real actors. And that's basically what happens with Sin City and the later films that he makes too. So Sin City is visually unique and it really set the stage for other movies that had this look. It had an excellent story and it was basically um, a bigger version of Pulp Fiction but with cooler visuals. The gritty story of the streets is really good, and if I had to really summarize what this movie's like, it's Joker, but of the last decade. It's sort of Joker before Joker, but also better. There's excellent character and character development here, so it's really top notch, and I recommend it to anyone who has a pulse, especially if you were one of those people who used to pretend to be in the Japanese shit because you wanted to bang Asian girls. Every decade needs its own Batman. I think that's safe to say. You have to have at least one Batman movie per decade. And Batman Begins was that movie for the 2000s. Now, yes, a lot of people today think more about Dark Knight, but they're not being objective. Because they need to really rewatch Batman Begins to appreciate what a Batman movie truly can be at its best. So Batman Begins has absolutely the best villain and the best story of any Batman movie. So first of all, it tells how Bruce Wayne became Batman. That's something that no previous Batman movie has ever done successfully. And it does so in a way that's really compelling. We also see Batman develop, and that enables us in the later movies to see him at his peak and then when he's in physical decline due to injury. So we get to have the full scope of Batman's career. Not only that, but Ra's al Ghul is very easily and clearly the best villain in the franchise. Yes, he is objectively a better villain than Joker. Let me explain. Ra's al Ghul is older and more experienced than Batman at a time when Batman is new to crime fighting. Therefore, Ra's al Ghul has all the edges on him. Ra's al Ghul is backed by a secret organization with centuries of experience. Batman doesn't have anything like that. Batman is just one guy. So the stakes are high, and oh, by the way, Ra's al Ghul is trying to end the world. So if we compare that to the other two movies, the worst that could happen is that Gotham City gets wrecked. Okay, how does that compare with literally ending the world and civilization? It doesn't. So this is the high stakes Batman. Let's say Batman had died in the pit in Dark Knight Rises. Well, he still would have been the greatest hero of all time because he would have saved civilization. Let's say he had died against the Joker. Well, Joker takes over Gotham and then probably dies of crack or something. So, again, this is the only one that is truly epic. The other ones have other things going for them, but this one also has all of these cards, really. And it's really a testament to how great this movie is that the sequels can be such a big drop-off while still being excellent. I think one of the reasons it stands out so much now is that a lot of people are really sick of all this wealth bashing. When Parasite won Best Picture after all it did was just shit on rich people, a lot of people were really upset about that. And I think that Batman Begins stands out even more now because it doesn't bash Bruce Wayne for being wealthy, but rather praises him for being so philanthropic. It's also the best, most realistic action in any of the Batman movies. It has realistic action scenes, and the camera angles in this, because they jerk around, it's like being in a real fight. If you've ever been in a real fight, you know that things move quickly and it can be disorienting. So it sort of gives you what it's like to be into fighting as Batman. So it's really great, and I wish they had stuck with that and that they would use that in more movies now because it is the way to show what fights are actually like. The second best movie of the 2000s, pretty easy pick, Casino Royale. This was the 007 franchise reboot. After a 4-year hiatus, they switched off Bonds, so Pierce Brosnan was replaced by Daniel Craig. Apparently some people were angry at the selection of Craig because he was blonde rather than brown-headed, and James Bond was supposed to be brown-headed and have a short neck. Well, that's stupid. Daniel Craig is a fucking awesome James Bond, and he kicked a lot of ass in all of his movies. So Daniel Craig plays Bond, and this is one of the best films ever. It's also the best spy movie of the decade. Not a big genre, but if you can win it and do it well, you can potentially have gold on your hands. And Casino Royale comes very close to being the best movie of the entire decade. It combines classic storytelling with a kind of reboot and originality. So there was an older movie called Casino Royale about Bond going to a casino, gambling, flirting, and getting information and getting in a gunfight. And they do all of that, but then they update everything to be about the modern age. And they also make Bond less of kind of a dick and more of this guy who is very serious minded. And it sort of like shows how the world has become less goofy. There's not a lot of Cold War Rocky and Bullwinkle stuff. It's a lot of serious grown up post 9/11 stuff. And this is the Bond for that era. It's still fun. There's still babes and gadgets, but the stakes are real. And at one point, that's brought home because Bond almost dies. And I won't spoil the ending, but he does take a serious personal loss. And it shows that espionage is for patriots and not for playboys. You can be a patriot playboy, but not just a playboy. So you have to be willing to potentially lose and lose horribly in order to play the game of espionage. The best movie of the 2000s is 300. This is the Frank Miller masterpiece. It builds on everything Sin City did, but then it goes truly epic by choosing one of the most badass things to ever happen in history. 300 is both the best film of the decade and a coming-of-age film for an entire generation. This is the film which gave people the opportunity to red pill in terms of being a man. The line, "This is Sparta," will live on forever. You could say that 20 years from now, and everybody would know exactly what you're talking about, because it's that iconic. This was a sword and sandal epic for the post 9/11 world. A lot of previous movies try to be a little too serious while not emphasizing the badassery at hand. But this shows that this was a world full of men who fought with their hands. And this really brings home what it means to be a man, what it means to be a Westerner, and what it means to be a warrior. The movie is about East versus West, good versus evil, freedom versus slavery. And it's told in a way that's accessible to the kids at the time, but in such a visually appealing style that it's still accessible even to kids who weren't born yet. So this has that manga style thing going on that I talked about earlier, but also it is just straight up badass. It's a timeless telling of a timeless story, and it gets almost all the historical details spot on. So it's amazing. Basically what happens is you have 300 warriors from Sparta who go to fight Persia all by themselves, and they nearly defeat them. It's amazing. And I can't possibly recommend this one high enough. Now, I don't think this was in contention for best movie of all time or anything like that, but if I did have to make a top 10 of all time, this one probably would manage to crack it. Until next time, I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing the truth with a truth-flavored bias, signing out.